6 months ago, I made a video titled Common Misconceptions about Ancient Rome, which is about, well, pretty much what it says on the title. I essentially cleared a few misconceptions people tend to have regarding ancient Rome. As such, this video will be to clear up some misconceptions about ancient Greece. 6, in fact. And in the same spirit of the previous video, I would like to recommend the wonderful The Hellenistic Age Podcast. There's a link available to the description down below if you want to listen to it. Let's start with the obvious one. Ancient Greece was a country. It was not, in fact, a country, nor a single political entity, nor anything of the sort. It can be more accurately described as a civilization, as it was not even that culturally united. The many Greek city-states did not all worship the same gods, and even the language differed quite a bit. In the Peloponnese, where Sparta is located, and in Crete, the people there largely spoke Doric Greek, whereas in the region of Attica, the people there mostly spoke Ionic Greek. And these weren't the only dialects, though it is important to note they were the most common. Eventually, the two common dialects became the Doric dialect and the Koine dialect, which is itself a natural evolution of the Ionic dialect, though by this point Rome had firm control over Greece and the eastern Mediterranean. Back to the question of the gods, it should also be noted that the gods themselves could widely differ. The best example being Aphrodite, who has an ungodly amount of different epitaphs, but just focusing on the three most distinct ones, you can see major differences in them. The first, Aphrodite Pandemos, is, I would say, the Aphrodite of the common imagination. That is, the goddess of love associated with romance, lust, and pleasure. There's Aphrodite Urania, goddess of love, but more spiritual and more associated with virtue. There's also Aphrodite Areia, which depicts Aphrodite in full armor, mostly because besides being a goddess of love, she was also a goddess of war. There's a good reason behind this, but I don't want to get into the rabbit hole of explaining why a goddess of love is also a goddess of war. If you really want to know why, Overly Sarcastic Productions made a video about it, so check them out. Point is, the gods and their worship would differ from area to area and city to city. This is all without mentioning that, of course, the city-states dotting the peninsula all competed against each other. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, Delphi, Elis, etc. all played in the dangerous, backstabbing game of war and diplomacy. Second misconception I'd like to clear out is one which, ironically, I had already cleared in my video on ancient Rome, regarding statues, buildings, and colors. Once again, the Greeks did paint their statues and their marble buildings. After all, the Romans were like this, and their culture was in many ways inspired by the Greeks. So why wouldn't the two be the same? The third misconception will be regarding the Battle of Thermopylae. The story of the 300 Spartans versus the 20 trillion Persians is a ridiculous exaggeration, as, for starters, the army of over 2 million Herodotus claims is ridiculous. Nobody actually knows how big the Persian army was, and plenty of estimates have been thrown around. The most recent ones vary between 120 and 300,000, but I'll throw in my own personal opinion and say that I think the Persian army was even smaller than this. It's just my random guess, and I recognize it isn't worth that much, but I'd say the Persians had a force ranging between 50 and 80,000 for the Battle of Thermopylae. As for the Greeks, well, the sources of this battle, both Herodotus and Diodorus Siculus, both put that the Greeks had over 5,000 men. The exact number is unknown, as the Greek forces were really just a coalition of several different city-states which aligned together against the Persians. But I'll say the number of men, at least according to both, could not have been higher than 8,000. The point here is, the 300 Spartans never fought the Persian army all by themselves. They had allies. Even in the last day of the battle, where it became clear the situation was hopeless, plenty of Greeks chose to withdraw, but some 700 Thespians and 400 Thebans chose to stay and fight alongside the Spartans. Even then, the Spartans were not alone. And speaking of the Spartans, we should move along to the fourth misconception, because it is entirely about Sparta. Specifically, the fact that the city-state of Sparta was not, in fact, called Sparta. Sparta refers to the cluster of settlements around the Eurotas River in Laconia, which is where the city, if you could really call it that, as it was pretty small, was located. However, the city-state went by a completely different name. It was called, and I'm giving my best shot here, Lacedaemon. And that was actually the name utilized in both the epics of Homer as well as by the historians Herodotus and Thucydides. The people of Sparta were called the Lacedaemonians, not the Spartans. So why do we refer to them as such? Well, I don't actually know why. I can only assume Sparta was a name that stuck around because that's what the group of settlements was called. And then seeing as the name of the city-state and the name of the city was often the same in ancient Greece, the name of Sparta just stuck around, all the while the name Lacedaemon was forgotten. This is merely my own assumption on it, not a fact. If anyone knows, by all means, explain this in the comment section below. For our fifth misconception, let's talk about the Athenian democracy, because in its case, the word democracy has to be applied very loosely. When I was a kid, I used to read a series of books a lot, and I actually kept reading them until the time I was a young adult. This was the book series called Horrible Histories, and I assume some of you probably read some of its books and cherish doing so. I bring this series up because one of the books, titled Groovy Greeks, talks quite a bit about the Athenian democracy, and I believe I'll be paraphrasing what the book says about it when I describe it. Everybody could vote, except the slaves, of course, and the immigrants, naturally, and the women, and freed slaves, and those who failed in paying state debts, and those not descended from two Athenian parents, and those who did not complete military training. Everybody else could vote. The point here is, the Athenian democracy wasn't really all that democratic. Don't get me wrong, given the percentage of population that participated in the government ranged between 10 and 20%, at least according to John Rothschild in his work Introduction to the Athenian Democracy of the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, this made Athens by far the city-state with the biggest percentage of the population actively engaging in its system of governance. However, the Athenian democracy should not be compared to current modern-day democracies. Also, I'm pretty rusty from what I learned in college, but I'm pretty sure here in the West, our systems of government aren't actually democracies, but republics. Specifically, democratic republics. The final misconception I'd like to clear up is regarding the status of women. At large, throughout not just ancient Greece, but throughout all of the ancient world, women were treated essentially as second-class citizens, often at best. But there is one notable exception, and that is Sparta. Sparta was a truly bizarre society, as they differed so heavily from all other city-states and, well, all other states. Sparta truly was something unique. Composing the overwhelming majority of Spartan society were the Helots, people whose status is enslaved, but in effect they're more comparable to medieval serfs than the slaves of the ancient world. Above the Helots you have the Perioikoi. They were free but not full Spartan citizens. They were under the obligation of following Spartan foreign policy and providing men to fight in the Spartan army, a bit like the tribes under Roman protection. Finally, a tiny minority, 35,000 being the highest estimate I've seen, were the Spartans proper. A society which prioritized military above everything else. Boys would undergo military training starting at the age of 7, and from that point onward they would be tied to military duty in some form or another until the age of 60. But what about women? Well, they were actually famous for having more freedom than women anywhere else in the Greek world. They may not have trained for military purposes, but they did exercise regularly, something I personally approve. Women possessed property rights, And due to a quirk in the inheritance law of Sparta, which made so that wives inherited their husband's property, Spartan women enjoyed a degree of wealth unrivaled in the Greek world. You have to consider, husbands dying while still young was common in the violent ancient world, and as such, it was incredibly easy for a Spartan woman to become incredibly rich as long as the man she married kept dying. This actually reached a point where the majority of Spartan wealth was held by a small group of women, their riches being bigger than the 2 Spartan kings. And before you ask, yes, Sparta had 2 kings. Add another point to Sparta's overall weirdness. And that's it for today. If there's another misconception about ancient Greece I didn't talk about for this video, leave it in the comments down below. Hope you enjoyed this little video, and hopefully I'll see you soon.